Hey guys, it's Shaylin, and I'm here today with another writing video. How to revise a book has been one of the most requested topics for a few years, and every time I get those comments, I always reply and say, when I'm done editing my book, then I will make this video, but I want to finish editing my book first so I have some experience to draw on. So today it's finally happening. I think the reason I haven't done it yet is because when are you done revising your book, right? That's hard to say. I already posted a video, either the last one or a couple videos ago, that was just some tips for revising a book. Today I'm going to be doing a draft breakdown of my revision process and what that looked like for me. Now, to be clear, this is just the draft breakdown and what I did to revise one novel. And it's going to be different for every person and for every single book also. Like every other book that I write, I'm sure will have a completely different draft breakdown. But I hope that this will be a valuable video, first of all, to give a general overview of what it could look like to edit a book. Not that it necessarily has to or will. Second of all, to give examples of how you might identify problems and how you might come up with solutions to fix them. So this is the draft breakdown for my novel Honey Vinegar. I started this book in 2018, so I've been working on it for 4 years, and so with that said, it's very possible that if you go back and watch earlier videos where I talk about this book, some of the information is different. That's just me not remembering correctly. Like, I'm not lying, I'm not trying to hide anything. I am trying to be like as transparent as possible about my revision process. But again, there were a lot of drafts, and it's not like I was taking notes on what each draft was while I was doing the book. Now I'm just retroactively trying to remember and think about what each draft looked like. The main obvious disclaimer that I just feel like I have to start with is this is how I revised this book. I'm not saying that this is how you should revise a book, or that this was a great editing process, or that this was the ideal revision process, or that I did this perfectly or anything. This is just kind of a realistic breakdown of what it actually looked like for me to revise this one novel. And I'm not saying that you should do these exact steps, or even that I did it the best efficient way. I just kind of took it one step at a time and did it as made most sense for me. Looking back, I don't really have any regrets as to how I approached the editing. I don't actually think I would have done anything that differently, but this was just what worked for me in this one case, and it's going to be different with everybody. So like I mentioned in my revisions tips video, I think there are kind of two different general types of writing processes: drafting focused writing processes and revision focused writing processes. I'm very much a drafting focused writer, meaning that I like to do as much as possible during my draft. I like to put as much work as possible into the first draft, so there's the least work possible in revision. I still did need to do a lot of edits and rounds of revision for this book, but because I like to do as much as possible while drafting, my first drafts take a long time and I edit a lot as I write. There were parts of my first draft that were a draft 20 by the time the book was finished. Drafts 1 and 2 kind of happened at the same time, and I'm calling it 2 drafts, but it was honestly way more than 2 drafts, but we're just gonna call it 2 drafts. 2 was the minimum. The last chapters of the book had 2 drafts. Earlier chapters of the book literally had 20. I started this book for a university writing workshop, which meant that I had to revise the first 5 chapters very, very deeply because I was submitting them to a class where I was getting graded on the quality, obviously, right? So that's why it took a very long time to get past the initial section of this book because I was writing for school. The first 5 chapters I wrote in the fall of 2018 for a workshop that started January of 2019. I edited those first 5 chapters extensively. I couldn't really tell you what those edits were. It was so long ago, and it was a very initial stage of the book that I don't really remember exactly what edits I made. I can tell you that because I discovery wrote this book, meaning I didn't plan it beforehand, and I really didn't plan it beforehand. I started this from square one, like I said, because it was for university. I didn't have time to plan it, and so I just had to start writing it from basically no idea. Those early first 5 chapters did have a lot of changes because I was figuring out the concept while I was writing them. I was figuring out where and when it was set. I was figuring out who my point of view character was. I was figuring stuff out a lot and obviously making a lot of changes as a result. I wouldn't even call them edits. It was more me solidifying my concept. I had 2 university workshops, the first one for chapters 1 through 3, and then the second one for chapters 4 and 5, which gave me a lot of feedback to work with. So with those revisions on the first 5 chapters, I did a very deep edit of the first 5 chapters from my university workshop feedback, and then throughout the spring and summer, I also got pretty detailed feedback because I did 2 more peer workshops with friends that I'd gone to university with, we were just hosting our own workshops outside of school. I think it was up to chapter 9, I'm not sure exactly. So that allowed me to do another really detailed editing pass up until the end of around chapter 9. By the summer of 2019, I'd done a deep editing pass of chapters 1 through 5, and then I'd done another deep editing pass of chapters 1 through 9. What were the biggest edits? Again, I wish I could remember a little better. A main one, working with some of my side characters. Some of them really came alive on the page, and some of them just didn't click. And so the ones that just didn't click literally didn't have personalities and didn't feel like people. One of the biggest edits was really thinking about some of these characters, stopping and doing some deep character development for them, as well as just differentiating them a little, working to figure out the relationship they had with my main character to really solidify those bonds. Also just like cutting scenes or beats my workshop identified as redundant, adding in information that the workshop felt would be helpful, or moving it to a more optimized placement. I initially had a chapter that's no longer in the book that was kind of there as a vehicle for a couple flashbacks. It happened fairly late, I think it was chapter 4 or 5 at the time. The scenes in those chapters really only served as a vehicle for flashback, and so I ended up just moving those flashbacks earlier and cutting all the fictive present stuff. Certain threads that my workshop realized were more important than I was necessarily giving them. There's a plague in my book. Initially was literally going to be a 1-chapter plot point and now goes throughout the whole book. Haven't we all been there? My initial structure for the book that I had in my mind was a little different from how it ended up on the page. In my mind, I thought that there would kind of be a series of chapters throughout the first half of the book. After like the initial introductory chapters leading up to the midpoint, there would be a series of chapters where kind of a weird event happens in the town in each one. And it would be like these series of events creating this escalating conflict. That was too clean a structure. So like the first little weird event was a plague that happens one winter. And originally that was going to be a 1-chapter thing, like just 1 chapter of plague, right? It all just was too clean. Consequences weren't getting played out. I then stopped and did another large editing pass at the end of part 1, which was chapter 13 at the time. I don't remember all of the edits that I made here, to be honest. The biggest one was retroactively killing a character. There was a character that I initially had not planned to kill off at this point in the book, but at a certain point I realized that it made sense for this character to be killed off. I realized this maybe when I was around chapter 11 or 12. And so this character was literally alive 1 scene earlier, and then I realized that I had to go back and edit them to have died. And so suddenly this character was dead. And so basically I had to go edit the book, add a chapter where this character literally dies, and then also write in my main character's reaction to that death. So that was a very significant edit. And that was an example of an edit that I was scared to make. When I realized I had to make that edit, I was like, oh shit, that's a huge edit. But oh my god, it makes everything fit together. There was also a chapter that was just straight up pointless that I cut. I have repurposed some parts of that chapter, but the chapter itself and the main beat of the chapter didn't really do anything, partly because it was a remnant of that initial structural idea I had where every chapter was a distinct episode. This episode was just not really doing anything. I did a big editing pass of part 1, and then I wrote part 2 all the way through and did some edits afterwards. That was the first draft of the book, but I kind of call it drafts 1 and 2 because I edited the book significantly while I was writing it. Okay, so this brings us to draft 3. This was my developmental edit. I kind of just call this the big edit, the main edit, because this is where the most stuff was happening. And interestingly here, I actually didn't have any feedback to work with. I had those workshops for the first third of the book that I'd done a lot of work, and those had really helped me. And I think had I not had those initial workshops, there would have been a lot of problems threaded throughout the entire book. They really helped me get myself on track. Going into this big developmental edit, I actually didn't have any feedback on the book. This was just me self-identifying problems. It's a whole book, and it was the first novel I'd written in a very long time, and so naturally there was a learning curve, and there were a lot of things that I just knew needed to be fixed. You know, I didn't need someone to tell me because it was just clear to me that these things weren't working. This was definitely the most involved draft, other than the first draft, obviously, which was huge because it was the first draft. And I'm a very involved drafter, but this was a very involved edit. Personally, I felt the main problem was causality and clarity associated with causality. I felt that the causal chain of my book, so that chain of every scene causing the next scene, I felt that there were a lot of places where those connections were not clear or maybe just not there at all. So making sure that every scene caused the next through a combination of internal motivation and external factors was my biggest concern. So in order to fix this, I made 3 tools, and this is why I always recommend that people make the tools that you need, right? If you have a problem, you have to just ask yourself, what tool can I make to help me fix this problem? My problem was causality. So the first thing that I did was make an outline. I had an evolving outline as I was drafting, but I wasn't very good at keeping up with it. And so at this point, it was not accurate at all. Like, it wasn't accurate to the scenes in the book. So the first thing I did was just go back and make an outline. So that was just a list of chapters and scenes within chapters. Then using that, I made a plot summary. I think this was about 3 or 4 pages single spaced. Then what I made was what I called a causality list. I went through my plot summary and I tried to identify the causal connection between every single scene. So every single scene, I literally wrote out what the causal connection was to the next scene. So it was like, this happens as a result causing this. So I had a list of scenes, and under each scene, I literally wrote how that scene was causing the next scene. And that helped me identify places where there was no causal connection, or the causal connection was simply not clear in the plot. Other large changes I made in this draft, and this is not all of the changes that I made, these are just the biggest ones that I can remember. There was a 3-chapter arc in part 2 that I was able to condense into 1 chapter. When I was, again, initially planning the book, part 1 is pretty big and complicated, and I figured part 2 would be equally long and complicated. I had a character in mind that I thought would kind of be like the primary side character of part 2, and so I had this whole 3-chapter arc planned for this character and the relationship between this character and the main character, and it literally did nothing to progress the plot. Like, it was just like an isolated little arc because, again, the structure didn't play out the way that I necessarily thought it would in my mind. And so I condensed that into just 1 chapter and gave it clear causality to the plot. This character that I'm referring to was initially only in part 2. I wrote this character into part 1 and also readjusted the roles certain characters played. Part of the reason why I wanted to write this character into part 1 is because I had this one character who I felt was being forced to act out of character for plot reasons, and I felt that due to this character's relationship with my main character, he would not do these things. I felt that this character that I had written just to be in part 2, but then hadn't been able to utilize as much as possible, and I liked this character, and I really liked the dynamic that this character had with my protagonist. I felt that that dynamic could be better utilized throughout the entire plot and could take off some of the burden of this character who was kind of being used in a very divisive way. I had to do a lot of rearranging to rearrange roles certain characters played, and this definitely caused, there were a lot of issues with dialogue. This new character I was writing in for a lot of drafts, his dialogue was very out of character in a lot of scenes, because it was literally dialogue that I had taken from other characters. It was really a lot. That was very messy. There were also a few points where I had to rearrange the order of chapters to create a more natural building tension. Also a few points where I added what I was calling hinge chapters. So this was to add causality and flow between various arcs of the book and to more fully play out consequences. Some things that happened, just the consequences were not fully played out, and so that was a big edit. And I also felt that there were certain points in the book where there was like a mini arc and a mini arc, but the bridge between them was lacking, and so I had to add these hinge chapters to bridge those arcs. Also, just to focus on general clarity, fleshing out and unifying themes and ideas. At this point, I had a much clearer idea of what the central theme of my book was, as well as what my main character's arc was. There were certain, near the beginning, for example, when I'd first written the early chapters, I'd still had so much to learn about my protagonist, making sure that she was written consistently. My main character, when I initially started writing the book, I felt that she was very emotionally muted, and I saw her as someone of not very drastic emotional response. That's not always true. She can actually be a bit of a ball of rage. And so I think that, you know, for example, there were certain scenes where her, in the beginning, where her emotional response was very muted. I also, at the very beginning, saw her as kind of an unbiased observer of what was going on, which is also not accurate. She's very judgmental. There were also some voicey things that I'd done in the very beginning. Again, keep in mind that I literally started writing this book the moment I got the idea. Like, there was zero pre-planning, right? The least pre-planning I have ever done for a book. Like, this was honestly pure discovery writing. That was really fun, but as a result, you're gonna have these things that are a bit inconsistent at the beginning while you're still figuring out your concept and character. There were some like formative things that I'd done with her voice at the beginning that I had really liked, but never came up again, and I never did again. And so I had to kind of write out those formative things, thinking that the form would be a little more playful, the voice would be a little more playful, when actually it was a bit more traditional. There were also, you know, many other smaller edits pertaining to specific scenes or chapters, but those were the main changes. Along with that draft, I was also doing a line edit. This is something that I do a little unconventionally, I would say. The typical advice is that you should start with big edits and work down to small edits. So start with developmental edits that pertain to your whole book, and then maybe go to chapter or scene level edits, and then go to line level edits. I do it all at once. First of all, I like to work linearly, especially for these bigger drafts. I can't just go jumping around the whole book. I get very disoriented and lost. Editing it's very easy for me to get overwhelmed, especially at this draft. This draft is a very overwhelming draft for me. So I like to progress linearly. You know, I had made an outline for my edits of every chapter and every scene that listed every change I wanted to make, anything I wanted to add, anything that should be cut. And so the way that I would approach each chapter is I would look at my outline for that chapter, and the first thing that I would do is I would move all the pieces. So I'd go through my chapter, I would cut any scene that was getting cut, move any scene that was getting moved. If there was anything new being added, I would write a little square bracket and I would write a little note about the new scene. So then I had the general structure of the chapter in place. Then I would go through and I would do all of my developmental edits. So I would write any new content that had been marked as new. I would, you know, do any of the developmental edits to each scene as it pertained to my outline, because I had broken down any changes I needed scene by scene. And then I would do another third pass of the chapter to line edit it and also smooth over continuity. So this draft was giant and took forever because I was doing 2 drafts at once. I was doing a developmental edit of each chapter, and then I was doing a line edit. That's just how I like to work. I like to do line edits constantly. I don't like to just leave them all to the end. I like to do them while I'm developmentally editing the book. For me, line is developmental. Things that are happening on the broad scale are also happening on the line. Your character's arc, which is a developmental edit, is happening through their word choice, right? Plot development is happening through detail choice and continuity. For me, it doesn't make sense to split up my line edits and my developmental edits, because line edits are also developmental edits. Your book's plot and character arcs are built of individual words, so I do it all at once. Otherwise, it's very easy for me to miss continuity issues, and also then I just end up with a cleaner line. However, that said, I do want to highlight a lesson learned. You have to be very careful when you're line editing at any stage, not just if you're doing it. Like, this could happen if you're just doing line edits as a line editing draft. Or you can edit out your style, specifically in the dialogue. As I got deeper into the book, I got a bit more impatient. I started glazing over chapters a little more quickly, not paying as much attention. I ended up writing out a lot of the natural rhythm and style. When I came back to these chapters later on in later drafts, it didn't have the flow that earlier chapters had. Earlier chapters had such good flow and sentence variety and sentence rhythm. Later chapters started to feel monotone. I had kind of edited a lot of the sentences and paragraphs to have the same structure because I was just glazing them over too quickly, and I did the same with the dialogue because I wasn't paying close enough attention. I edited a lot of the characters' dialogue to sound the same as the narrative voice, and so I wrote out a lot of voice for a lot of my characters that was a pain to fix later because I literally had to write it back in. That was just a lesson learned there. You can't get checked out. I started getting checked out. It was a long book. I was getting tired. The edits were big. And as I was reading through, just making little edits, a lot of those edits weren't helping. They were actually harming. So that's something that I would be very careful with from now on when I'm editing a book, but that I didn't know because I wasn't thinking about, and it caused me problems. That was draft 3 and 4. Draft 5 is the first time that I get some feedback. So I gave a book to a friend critique partner of mine. However, she didn't really read the book as a critique partner would. She kind of just read it as a reader, which was honestly what I think helped me the most at that point, was just to get an overall sense of what works, what doesn't, like a reader would read it. Obviously, she's a good editor, so when she was reading the book, she had notes for me, but she kind of just read it in a few days, very quickly, like you would if you were reading any regular book, which was very helpful for me to give a sense of how the book reads as a full work. She had a few notes for me. Almost all of them were concentrated into the second half of the book, which made sense because the first half of the book at this point had been seen and edited by so many people. Part 2 had never been read by anyone. So she had some suggestions for the end, which, was the least edited part of the book. And I kind of knew that it was underwritten because I tend to be an underwriter. I really did feel that it wasn't fully fleshed out, but I just needed help getting it there. So she had some ideas to help with that. And as well, there were some threads that I had basically just dropped. Like, there was a character, and she was like, what happened to this character? Like, literally, where were they in part 2? Like, what happened? And I was like, I forgot about him, okay? Look, I forgot about him. That's why he wasn't in part 2. Okay, so I had to also work on some threads that I had just kind of dropped because I initially thought this was going to be a pretty short, straightforward book, and it ended up amassing a lot more threads and a lot more characters than I initially anticipated, and I did lose track of some of them. Draft 6, I took a bit of time away from the book, and this just let me reflect on things and gave me some more ideas of things I wanted to flesh out or change or add. As well, I went back and I actually did some lingering research. I did most of my research while writing. Some lingering things that I just needed to research. So yeah, I don't really remember exactly what these things were. It was kind of just like a bunch of random notes I'd taken. At this point, it wasn't linear. I was just going in and doing a bunch of touch-ups. Draft 7 was another round of feedback. So I passed the book on to another friend, critique partner of mine, also to my family, not expecting them to necessarily critique it, but of course they will have thoughts, and my brother in particular is a very good reader, and he is very straight up with me, you know? They say family don't give honest edits. I think my brother gives me the most straight up honest take that I'll ever get from anyone. So when I got the feedback back from my critique partner, at this point it was mostly scene or chapter level concerns on the developmental side. There was nothing giant left, but it was like chapters or scenes that needed clarity or work. Could this be set up earlier? Could this be patterned in fully? Stuff like that. And my critique partner also did line edits for me, which was very helpful. I did this a bit of an odd order. My critique partner sent me the first half of the edits and I did them, but I still felt that the second half of the book was weaker and a lot messier than the first half because it had been revised less. They were a little delayed anyways, and so I was like, you know what? I have some changes I want to make to part 2. So I went and did my own, another pass of the second half of the book, actually, to clean some stuff up. I was able to make a lot of cuts, and then I sent them the second half, and then they revised that, and then I did another draft of the second half of the book from their feedback, which really helped me feel more confident in the second half of the book, which had not been edited as much. Yeah, mostly small stuff. I can't really remember all of it or really tell you what it was because it wouldn't really make sense out of context. At this point, I felt I hadn't gotten enough feedback on the book because multiple people had read the book at this point and no one had any large-scale structural or conceptual concerns. I was just consistently getting the thumbs up on pacing, structure, and characterization. And, you know, I value my critique partner's feedback very deeply, and so I know that they're very good editors, and so I trust them to do very thorough edits of the book. And so at this point, I just felt like I had gotten the feedback that I needed. The edits were small enough that I felt pretty confident. So that was draft 7. Draft 8 was, I read it like a reader. So at this point, I felt confident in the book. Did I think it was perfect? No. But it was doing what I wanted it to do. I felt like I could clearly articulate what I wanted this book to do in terms of theme and character, and I felt like the book was articulating those things as well. So then I read the book as fast as possible to get a sense for how it read as a reader, right? I had always read it as a writer, spread out of order, over months. I wanted to read it like a reader would. So I read it over 4 days. As I was reading it, I did obviously small line edits, nothing major. At this point, right, I had done detailed line edits myself multiple times, and also from my critique partner, who is a very good line editor, and so I think caught most things. I really just wanted a sense for how it all flowed together. And then finally is draft 9, which is kind of where I currently am, and this is just like addressing lingering issues. There are just a few lingering things that bother me, a couple loose threads that I don't really know how to wrap up. I was actually talking about one of them with one of my friends, my critique partner, the first person who ever read the book, and I was talking with her about it, and I was like, there's this one thing that's killing me with this book. I can't figure out how to make this tie together. And she was like, just do this simple thing. And I was like, yeah, just like random lingering threads, but overall I'm pleased with the book, and I know there will be future edits at the agent or publication stage, but this is kind of how I edited my book myself to get it to the point where I could pursue publication with it, is basically what I'm saying. So is this a perfect finalized draft forever? No. Is it where I want it to be? Yes. And I think that there are, a handful of lingering things that I'm trying to touch up, but for the most part, I think it's there. That's really all for this one, guys. These are the 2 videos that I had planned on revision, but I feel very confident talking about revision. Before, it was something that I felt I couldn't speak to with as much conviction because I had never edited a book to a point of completion, but I've now done it twice, and I'm working on it with my 3rd book. And so I think I have a really good handle of the revision process, and that's where I think I've improved the most over the past 2 years, is confidence with revision. Those were the 2 videos that I had planned on revision. If there are any other revision related topics that you would like me to cover, please feel free to drop a comment. I know it's a topic that people have a lot of questions about, and I was so overwhelmed. When I started editing this book, I'll admit I was deeply overwhelmed. And so if I could help ease that process for anyone, I will do my best. Obviously, I think no nugget of wisdom from someone who's edited a couple books, not that I'm the world leading expert, will necessarily take away the fear of editing your book, which is a huge task. I would love to talk more on this topic. I'm just not sure what would be helpful, and these were the only 2 videos I had planned. So that's all for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.